The first whispers started innocuously enough. A misplaced check here, a donation record that didn't quite add up there. Most residents didn't notice, or if they did, they shrugged it off. HOA presidents, after all, were meant to be trustworthy. They were supposed to be the guardians of community values, the ones who handled our money responsibly, the ones who ensured that the neighborhood ran smoothly. But sometimes, the people we trust the most hide the darkest secrets. Martha Reynolds, a retiree who had lived in the community for over 30 years, was the first to sense that something was wrong. She wasn't a nosy neighbor, she wasn't the type to dig through other people's affairs. But she noticed patterns. Charities supposedly sponsored by the HOA were receiving donations that seemed oddly excessive. She remembered the annual report where the HOA claimed to have donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to causes like children's hospitals, animal shelters, and disaster relief funds. But when she checked online, none of these charities seemed to exist, not even a trace. She raised her concerns at the next HOA meeting, expecting a simple explanation. Surely it had to be a clerical error, but the room was thick with tension the moment she mentioned it. Faces shifted uncomfortably. People avoided eye contact, and then came the HOA president himself, Richard Hale. At first glance, Richard seemed like the perfect community leader. Tall, charismatic, with a voice that commanded attention, he had been elected unanimously 5 years ago. He always smiled, always shook hands, always promised transparency. But the smile that day felt practiced. His eyes, sharp and calculating, followed Martha's every word. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said smoothly, leaning against the polished wooden podium, "I assure you all our donations are legitimate. We maintain full records. Perhaps you misread something." But Martha's instincts told her otherwise. She had been meticulous in her research. She had pulled bank statements, cross-checked charity registrations, and even contacted the so-called charities directly. Every single one of them returned the same answer: they had never received a donation from the HOA. That night, as Martha sat alone in her dimly lit living room, she felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Something about Richard Hale didn't sit right. She remembered the subtle luxuries he flaunted at community events, the imported wine, the new car he always drove, the vacations he casually mentioned. How could someone in a volunteer position afford such things? Questions raced through her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Could it be possible that the HOA president was siphoning money for himself? And if so, how deep did this deception go? Over the following weeks, Martha began her quiet investigation. She wasn't a detective, and she had no special skills beyond persistence. But she had something more powerful than credentials: intuition. She combed through years of HOA financial statements, noting every inconsistency. Tiny transactions in seemingly innocent accounts began to paint a bigger picture. Several $1,000 transfers, categorized vaguely as charitable contributions, were directed toward accounts that had no public record. And the recipients? Names she had never heard, linked to shell companies and dummy accounts. Then came the first concrete evidence. A former HOA accountant who had recently retired reached out to Martha. He spoke nervously, glancing around as if afraid someone might be listening. "It's worse than you think," he whispered. "Richard set up fake charity accounts years ago. Every year, donations came in from residents under the guise of charity, but the money never left the accounts. He used them for personal expenses, vacations, even investment properties." Martha felt her stomach churn. Investment properties? This was no small-time fraud. This was a carefully orchestrated operation, one that had been ongoing for years without anyone noticing. The accountant handed her copies of internal spreadsheets, emails, and banking documents, proof of a systematic scheme that could ruin the reputation of the entire HOA. She knew she couldn't confront Richard alone. He was popular, influential, and dangerous if cornered. Yet the idea of exposing him consumed her thoughts. Every night she lay awake imagining the reaction of the community, the betrayal etched on the faces of neighbors who had trusted him blindly. Some of them had donated thousands, believing they were helping children, the elderly, or disaster victims. And all the while, Richard Hale had been pocketing it. Martha decided to approach a journalist. She needed someone who could handle the story delicately but also had the reach to bring the truth to light. That's when she met Thomas Quinn, an investigative reporter known for exposing white-collar crime. At first, he was skeptical. He had seen many conspiracy theories crumble under scrutiny, but the documents Martha presented were compelling. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the paper trail. Thomas agreed to take the story, understanding the potential risks. Their collaboration began cautiously. They exchanged encrypted emails and met in quiet coffee shops. Every detail mattered: bank transfers, emails from Richard, HOA board meeting minutes, invoices from supposed charities that didn't exist. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. The accounts weren't just for personal use. They were cleverly designed to disguise lavish spending, including luxury cars, expensive jewelry, private school tuition for Richard's children, and even a secret offshore account. Meanwhile, Richard Hale's behavior began to change. He noticed the subtle scrutiny, the raised eyebrows, the questions that started creeping into casual conversations. At community events, he would smile tightly, shake hands a little too firmly, and answer questions with rehearsed politeness. But behind that mask, something darker was brewing. Martha could sense it. The man who once seemed so charming now radiated tension, as if aware that the walls were closing in. Then came the turning point. A small fire broke out at the HOA office late one night. No one was hurt, but important files were destroyed. Insurance claimed it was accidental, a result of faulty wiring. But Thomas and Martha suspected otherwise. The timing was too perfect. Critical documents that could have implicated Richard in earlier years had vanished. The fire was a warning, a message that someone powerful wanted to keep their secrets buried. Despite the danger, Martha refused to back down. She and Thomas focused on what remained: digital records, emails, and bank statements that had been backed up outside the office. Each discovery revealed layers of deception. There were fake charity board members, forged signatures, and a web of shell corporations registered in multiple states. The scheme was sophisticated, designed to survive casual scrutiny and even audits. The community, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. HOA meetings went on as usual. Richard Hale stood at the podium, smiling, applauding the volunteers, thanking residents for their generosity. No one suspected that behind the polished speeches, millions of dollars were being funneled into accounts no one could trace. And yet, the closer Martha and Thomas got to the truth, the higher the stakes became. One night, Thomas received a cryptic message on his secure phone: "Stop digging or there will be consequences." It was unsigned, but the threat was clear. Fear seeped into their work, yet it only strengthened their resolve. They had seen too much to turn back now. Martha, once a quiet retiree, now became a relentless force. Every lead mattered, every anomaly had to be pursued, no matter the risk. As the story began to take shape, the question that haunted both of them was simple yet terrifying. How long had Richard Hale been hiding millions, and what would he do if the truth came out? The residents trusted him with their money, their confidence, and their sense of community. And in that trust, he had found his greatest weapon. But secrets, as Martha knew now, never stay buried forever. And Richard Hale, for all his cunning, had underestimated the resolve of one woman determined to reveal the truth. The first part of their investigation was complete. They had proof, a trail of evidence pointing directly to Richard Hale. But as they prepared to go public, a new twist emerged, one that neither of them had anticipated. One of the fake charity accounts had disappeared entirely from the banking system. The money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, had vanished overnight, leaving no trace. Martha stared at her screen, disbelief washing over her. Could it have been transferred offshore? Had Richard moved faster than they anticipated? The stakes had just skyrocketed. What started as a quiet suspicion in a retiree's mind had now evolved into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. And as she looked out her window into the quiet suburban night, she realized one chilling truth. The man everyone trusted with their money, their community, and their secrets might be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they revealed was far more sinister than anyone could have guessed. And this was only the beginning. The question now hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. How do you stop a man who has spent years building illusions so perfect that no one could see the truth? Martha didn't know yet, but one thing was certain: she couldn't stop now, not when the stakes were this high and not when millions were at risk. And as the screen faded to black in her mind, the suspense lingered like a storm on the horizon. Who was Richard Hale really? And how much was he willing to destroy to protect his secret? The disappearance of the charity account wasn't just alarming, it was terrifying. Hundreds of thousands of dollars gone without a trace. Martha stared at the screen for what felt like hours, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Thomas, sitting across from her in the small coffee shop they now used as their makeshift operations base, ran his hands through his hair. "This isn't random," he said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. "This is intentional. Richard Hale is covering his tracks, and fast." Martha nodded, her mind racing. If the account had been moved offshore, it would take forensic experts weeks, maybe months, to trace it, and even then there was no guarantee it would be recovered. But she knew they couldn't wait. Every second they hesitated, more of his trail vanished. They decided to focus on what remained: internal communications, emails, and the remnants of old accounts. Thomas dug into the digital records, meticulously cross-referencing each entry. Every new lead revealed more of the complexity behind Richard's scheme. It wasn't just about personal wealth, it was about power, control, and deception on a scale Martha had never imagined. One email in particular sent chills down her spine. It was from Richard himself, sent to one of the fake charity accounts, instructing the transfer of funds labeled as urgent allocation. The language was casual, almost mundane, but the implications were clear. He wasn't just diverting money, he was orchestrating an elaborate network of deception, carefully planning every step to avoid detection. Martha felt a wave of anger. How could someone manipulate an entire community with such ease? The residents trusted him completely. They had voted him into office, applauded his speeches, and celebrated his supposed generosity. And all the while, he had been using that trust to build a personal empire, one donation at a time. They needed evidence, hard evidence that could not be dismissed. They contacted a financial forensic expert, someone who specialized in tracing illicit transfers. After days of poring over documents, the expert confirmed their fears. Every fake charity account was linked directly to Richard. The transactions were structured to look legitimate, but they all funneled into a handful of personal accounts. The scale was staggering, millions of dollars. Money that had been donated in good faith, now lining the pockets of one man. As the reality sank in, Martha realized the danger they faced. Richard Hale was not just a cunning manipulator, he was someone who could stop at nothing to protect himself. The fire at the HOA office, the threats, they were not idle warnings. He had the resources, the influence, and now, potentially, the motivation to silence them. But before they could act, another shocking development occurred. One evening, Thomas received a tip from an anonymous source within the HOA itself. The message was short, cryptic, but impossible to ignore. "He knows you're digging, trust no one, the next move will be violent." Martha felt a cold chill run down her spine. Someone inside the organization was feeding them information, but who could they trust? Every face in the HOA boardroom now seemed suspicious. Every handshake, every smile could mask hidden motives. The next morning, Martha returned to her home, finding the mailbox rifled through. Personal letters were torn open, documents she had printed for the investigation were missing. Someone had been inside her house. The sense of violation was overwhelming. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about survival. They needed a new plan. Moving forward meant more than collecting evidence, it meant staying ahead of a predator. Thomas suggested going public, using media coverage as a shield, but Martha hesitated. Going public too soon could provoke Richard, and with the missing millions, he had no reason to hold back. Instead, they decided on a slow, methodical approach. Each discovery would be documented, verified, and cross-checked. Every financial transaction, every email, every meeting minute would be preserved. They began to interview former HOA employees discreetly, piecing together years of internal operations. One by one, patterns emerged: how Richard manipulated board votes, how he intimidated dissenters, how he masked personal expenses as community costs. One former board member, Eleanor James, revealed a startling detail. She had confronted Richard years ago about discrepancies in the charity accounts. According to her, Richard had smiled, shrugged, and said, "People trust what they want to believe. That trust is mine to command." Eleanor's voice trembled as she recounted the encounter. "I didn't realize then how literal he meant it. He wasn't just lying about money, he was controlling everyone around him." Martha and Thomas realized the scope of the deception. Richard's influence extended far beyond finances. He had cultivated loyalty through fear, charm, and subtle manipulation. Every volunteer, every donor, every resident had unknowingly participated in his web, and anyone who questioned him risked exposure, embarrassment, or worse. Despite the danger, they pressed on. Their investigation took them into the heart of the community, uncovering not just financial misconduct but moral corruption. Fake charity events, staged donation ceremonies, even fake testimonials from supposed beneficiaries, all part of a carefully constructed illusion. The more they uncovered, the more the image of the benevolent HOA president crumbled. Then came the breakthrough. Thomas managed to access a secure cloud backup Richard had used to store sensitive documents. Among the files were personal letters, detailed accounts of investments, and most damningly, a ledger of every donation routed through fake charity accounts. The ledger included names, dates, amounts, and the eventual destination of funds. It was irrefutable proof. Martha felt a surge of adrenaline. Finally, they had what they needed to expose Richard completely. But the elation was short-lived. Within hours of discovering the files, Thomas received another anonymous message: "Stop or everyone you care about suffers, you're out of time." Fear and resolve collided. They couldn't stop now. The ledger was their key to justice and the world had to see it. But the danger was real, immediate, and growing. Richard Hale was no longer a distant figure of suspicion, he was a threat, watching, waiting, and ready to strike. The next move was critical. Martha and Thomas planned to confront the HOA board collectively, armed with evidence. The goal wasn't just to reveal Richard, it was to protect the community and recover the stolen funds, but they knew the confrontation would be perilous. Richard had allies loyal to him not just out of respect but out of fear. Any misstep could be catastrophic. On the day of the confrontation, the HOA boardroom was tense. Richard entered as usual, exuding confidence, unaware that his carefully constructed empire was about to crumble. Martha's heart pounded. Thomas's hands shook as he prepared to present the ledger. When Martha spoke, her voice was steady yet carried the weight of every betrayal they had uncovered. "Richard Hale," she began, "we know what you've done. Every donation, every account, every lie has been documented. Millions of dollars meant for charity have been diverted into personal accounts, and we have proof." A stunned silence fell over the room. Richard's expression shifted, his practiced charm faltering. For the first time, he was confronted not by speculation or rumor but by irrefutable evidence. "What are you implying?" Richard's voice was controlled, but there was a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Martha opened the ledger, displaying it clearly. "Every transaction is recorded. Every fake charity account is traced back to you. The community trusted you and you betrayed them. This ends now." The boardroom erupted in chaos. Some members gasped, others whispered. A few tried to defend Richard, citing loyalty, years of service, or perceived misunderstandings. But the ledger was undeniable. The numbers didn't lie and the paper trail led directly to him. Richard's face hardened. "You think this proves anything? You have documents, I have influence, you'll see truth is relative." But the room had shifted. Fear and admiration had been replaced by shock and betrayal. The board realized that loyalty built on deception was fragile. And as Richard Hale's empire of lies began to crumble, a new question emerged. How far would he go to protect himself? Martha and Thomas knew the fight was far from over. The ledger was only the beginning. Richard could still evade justice, manipulate narratives, and threaten those who opposed him. But for the first time, the community glimpsed the truth. A man they trusted had been hiding millions in plain sight. And in that moment, a single thought lingered in Martha's mind. The battle was only starting and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. The question now wasn't just whether Richard Hale would be held accountable, it was whether anyone could stop him before he struck again. The room settled into tense silence, each person aware of the fragility of trust, the magnitude of betrayal, and the dangerous man at the center of it all. And as Martha left the boardroom that night, ledger in hand, she knew one undeniable truth: exposing the deception was just the beginning. The storm had only just begun. The night after the confrontation, Martha couldn't sleep. The ledger lay open on her kitchen table, the numbers glaring back at her like a challenge. She had exposed the truth to the HOA board, but the feeling of victory was fleeting. Richard Hale was no ordinary man. He was clever, ruthless, and unafraid to cross lines no one else would. Thomas called her early the next morning. His voice was tense, urgent. "Martha, we have a problem. I just got a call from someone claiming to be an auditor for the HOA. They want to meet with us tonight." Martha's stomach turned. It could be legitimate. It could also be a trap. Every instinct screamed caution, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. "Where?" she asked. "In a parking garage on the edge of town," Thomas replied. "They said it's private, no cameras." The warning bells rang loudly in Martha's mind, but she had to know. They agreed to meet, taking precautions, texting friends their location, driving separate cars, and keeping their phones ready for emergencies. The city streets were quiet as they arrived, shadows stretching across the dim concrete structure. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hood that obscured his face. "Martha Reynolds?" the man asked, voice low and controlled. "Yes," she replied, trying to keep her own voice steady. The man nodded and handed her a folder. "This is evidence Richard Hale didn't want you to see. Inside you'll find transactions, emails, and bank records he's tried to hide. Use it wisely, and be careful. He knows you're close to the truth." Before Martha could ask questions, the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps. Thomas and Martha exchanged glances, both exhilarated and terrified. This was a gift, a missing puzzle piece in their investigation, but it also confirmed something frightening. Richard Hale was aware of their moves, watching, calculating. Back at Thomas's office, they spread the documents across the table. The files revealed an even darker side of Richard's operation than they had imagined. Hidden accounts in offshore banks, shell corporations, and fake foundations created to funnel money back into his personal ventures. Everything pointed to a man who had spent years perfecting his deception. But there was one entry that made Martha gasp. It wasn't a financial record. It was a personal note written in Richard's handwriting describing potential threats to his secrecy. The tone was cold, almost clinical. It listed names, residents, board members, and even staff people who had questioned him in the past. Each name had a status: neutralized, monitored, warning issued. Martha and Thomas looked at each other in horror. Richard hadn't just hidden money, he had tracked people, calculated risk, and anticipated exposure. That night, a sense of urgency gripped them. The investigation had become far more dangerous than they had imagined. Richard Hale wasn't just a fraudster, he was a predator, methodical and patient, capable of turning suspicion into real harm. The next day, they received an anonymous tip. A safe deposit box in a nearby bank contained additional documents, contracts, and photographs. Whoever was helping them, whether out of conscience or revenge, was clearly risking a lot. Martha and Thomas went to the bank, nerves taut. The box was unremarkable, metal and cold, but inside were files that confirmed everything. The fake charities, the personal expenditures, even secret meeting notes where Richard discussed strategies to deflect audits and intimidate whistleblowers. But the deeper they dug, the more audacious Richard's moves became. A threatening email arrived at Thomas's account, stating bluntly, "Stop now, you don't know who you're dealing with. One wrong move and it will cost lives." The message was unsigned, but the tone left no doubt who it was from. The ledger, the emails, the bank records, they weren't enough to intimidate him. He was willing to escalate. Despite the threats, they pressed forward. They started connecting with residents who had donated to the fake charities, many of whom were shocked, confused, and angry. Some didn't believe the evidence at first, blinded by years of trust. Others were devastated. Many had donated life savings, believing in a man who had manipulated their goodwill. Martha felt a weight she had never known, the burden of being the bearer of such a terrible truth. Then came a late-night call from Eleanor James, the former board member. "Martha, Thomas, it's him. He came to my house, threatened me, said if I spoke to you again, it would be the last time anyone saw me. You have to be careful, he's dangerous." Martha hung up, her hands trembling. Richard Hale wasn't bluffing. The facade of community leader was gone. What remained was something much darker, a man who had hidden millions, tracked people, and now actively tried to silence anyone who exposed him. The next morning, they noticed something strange. A small, black SUV had been parked near Martha's home for hours. The driver never left the car. When she went outside, the vehicle sped off. They were being watched. Richard's reach extended into the very streets they walked. Fear became constant. Every movement, every conversation, every digital trace had to be guarded. Determined not to be intimidated, Martha and Thomas turned to law enforcement. They presented the ledger, the files, and the anonymous tips. The initial response was cautious. Law enforcement knew of Richard Hale, but the magnitude of the scheme was unprecedented. Investigators began quietly tracing the offshore accounts, interviewing residents, and monitoring Richard's activity. But Richard was not idle. Within days, news of an internal investigation leaked to the community, casting doubt on Martha and Thomas. Suddenly, whispers spread about potential false accusations, rumors questioning their credibility. Richard was playing a psychological game, using the community's trust as a shield while continuing his operations behind closed doors. Martha realized the stakes were now as much about perception as evidence. If the public believed Richard, months of work could vanish. They had to expose him publicly, but carefully, strategically, and safely. One misstep could allow him to vanish with the money or retaliate against those who dared speak. Amid the chaos, an unexpected ally emerged, a young accountant who had worked under Richard briefly before leaving due to ethical concerns. She provided crucial testimony about internal meetings where Richard instructed employees to manipulate accounts, fabricate receipts, and intimidate dissenters. Her statements corroborated Martha and Thomas's findings, building an unshakable case. With law enforcement slowly mobilizing, Richard's behavior became erratic. The charm and control were cracking. At HOA events, his smiles were tighter, his gestures forced. Rumors circulated. And some residents began questioning what they had been told for years. Yet, Richard's cunning remained. He knew how to manipulate perception, to sow doubt, to divert suspicion. One evening, Thomas noticed a series of unusual transfers, smaller sums moving rapidly between accounts. It appeared Richard was preparing for something, either to hide more money or to flee. The pressure intensified. The investigation had become a race against time. Then the unthinkable happened. A violent confrontation outside Martha's home. A car sped toward her driveway, tires screeching, but it swerved at the last moment, narrowly missing her. A note was left on her doorstep: "Step back, this is your final warning." Martha stood frozen, heart racing. The threat was real, the danger tangible, but resignation was not an option. She knew now that exposing Richard meant confronting the darkest corners of human greed, manipulation, and vengeance. As Part 3 closes, the tension is palpable. Richard Hale's desperation grows, the threats escalate, and the investigation is closer than ever to uncovering the full extent of his crimes. And the question lingers, sharper than ever. Will Martha and Thomas survive long enough to bring him to justice, or will Richard's web of deception claim them before the truth can emerge? The night was silent, unnaturally so. Martha sat by her window watching the empty street, heart hammering in her chest. Every shadow, every flicker of movement felt like a threat. Richard Hale had escalated, and the previous attempt on her safety made one thing painfully clear: he would stop at nothing to protect himself. Thomas arrived shortly after, clutching a stack of documents and a small recording device. "We have everything," he said quietly. "Ledger entries, emails, bank statements, witness testimonies, even recordings of Richard instructing employees to falsify donations. This is airtight." Martha nodded, determination hardening in her chest. "Then it's time, no more waiting, we expose him now." They coordinated with law enforcement, carefully planning a sting operation. Investigators would confront Richard with evidence while ensuring the safety of anyone involved. Every step had to be precise. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and desperate. One misstep could allow him to escape or worse. As dawn broke, Martha and Thomas arrived at the HOA headquarters, their nerves taut. Law enforcement agents were already inside, posing as administrative staff and auditors. Hidden cameras recorded every corner of the building. They were ready. Richard arrived shortly after, entering with his usual confidence. But there was something different about him today. His smile was tight, his eyes darting nervously. Something told Martha that he sensed the walls closing in. The first confrontation began in his office. Officers revealed themselves, and one by one, documents and evidence were laid out before him. The ledger, emails, and bank transfers were displayed clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Richard Hale leaned back in his chair, a slow, calculating smile forming. "You really think this is enough?" he asked, voice smooth but laced with menace. "It's more than enough," the lead investigator replied firmly. "You've diverted millions from the community, created fake charities, and threatened those who opposed you. We have all the proof. You're under arrest." For a moment, Richard's calm demeanor faltered. The officers advanced, and panic flickered in his eyes. He realized that years of deception, manipulation, and intimidation had finally caught up with him. There was no charm, no influence, no loyal board members left to shield him. But even then, he made one last desperate attempt. He lunged for a drawer, trying to destroy evidence. Quick-thinking officers subdued him, restraining his hands and ensuring the critical documents remained intact. Martha and Thomas watched, a mix of fear and vindication washing over them. After years of silence, manipulation, and fear, justice was finally closing in. The arrest was swift and public. News spread through the community like wildfire. Headlines screamed of the HOA president who had hidden millions in fake charity accounts. Residents, some shocked, some enraged, began coming forward, offering statements and personal accounts. The scale of Richard Hale's betrayal became undeniable. Martha felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The man who had haunted her community for years was finally behind bars, but the emotional toll was immense. Trust had been shattered, and the very fabric of the neighborhood's social bonds had been poisoned. For some residents, the realization that their generosity had been exploited left a lingering bitterness. Even with Richard's arrest, questions remained. How much money could be recovered? How deep did his network go? And how many lives had been affected by his manipulation? Authorities worked tirelessly to trace every transaction, freeze offshore accounts, and reclaim as much as possible for the victims. Slowly, the truth unraveled, revealing the full scope of the scheme. During the investigation, additional shocking details emerged. Richard had not only siphoned money but had maintained a meticulous record of who questioned him, who could potentially expose him, and who he perceived as threats. His network of deception extended far beyond the fake charities, encompassing a web of intimidation and psychological manipulation. He had built an empire on fear, trust, and secrecy, and now every strand was being dismantled. Community meetings were held to help residents process the revelations. Some cried, some shouted, some simply sat in stunned silence. Martha was invited to speak, and she addressed the community with a voice steady despite her emotional exhaustion. "We were betrayed by someone we trusted completely," she said, voice carrying through the hall. "But now we have the chance to reclaim what was lost not just financially but in our sense of trust, compassion, and integrity. We can rebuild." Thomas stood beside her, silent but supportive. Together they had uncovered the truth, exposed the deception, and ensured that Richard Hale could no longer harm anyone. Their courage and persistence had turned the tide, proving that one determined individual could challenge even the most calculated predators. Richard Hale faced federal charges including fraud, embezzlement, and intimidation. His bail was set impossibly high, and the prospect of spending decades behind bars loomed over him. Despite his previous confidence, the reality was undeniable: he had been defeated. As the weeks passed, the community slowly began to heal. Charities that were legitimate received renewed support. HOA meetings resumed with increased transparency, stricter oversight, and active participation from residents determined not to be deceived again. The trust that Richard had exploited was fragile. But with effort, it could be rebuilt. Martha returned to her quiet life, the tension of the past months giving way to cautious peace. She continued to monitor the case, ensuring that justice followed through to the end. Yet she couldn't ignore the lingering impact of the ordeal, the knowledge that someone could manipulate an entire community with cunning, patience, and a ruthless disregard for morality. Thomas, ever the reporter, published a detailed exposé on the entire operation. The story went viral, exposing Richard's intricate scheme and the lessons learned about trust, vigilance, and accountability. It was more than a news article; it was a cautionary tale, a narrative that reminded communities everywhere to question authority, verify claims, and protect one another. In the end, Richard Hale was removed from power, stripped of his influence, and faced the full consequences of his actions. The millions he had hidden began to be recovered, and though it could never undo the betrayal, it restored a sense of justice to the community he had manipulated for so long. Martha, looking out at her neighborhood one evening, reflected on the ordeal. She had embarked on this journey seeking only to uncover the truth, yet she had discovered much more: the resilience of ordinary people, the power of persistence, and the importance of standing against corruption, no matter how entrenched it seemed. The story of Richard Hale became a legend in the community, a tale of betrayal, cunning, and ultimately, accountability. And for Martha, Thomas, and the residents, it was a reminder that vigilance, courage, and integrity could triumph even in the face of calculated deception. But some nights, when the wind rustled through the trees and shadows stretched across the streets, Martha still felt a flicker of unease. Richard Hale had been meticulous, patient, and ruthless. And while justice had prevailed this time, the thought lingered: there would always be others, waiting, calculating, ready to exploit trust for their own gain. Yet for now, the nightmare was over. The community had survived, stronger and wiser. The millions once hidden in fake charity accounts were being recovered. Richard Hale was behind bars, and Martha, once a quiet retiree, had become the unexpected guardian of her neighborhood's truth. As the sun set over the quiet streets, a sense of calm returned. But the story, like all tales of deception and courage, left a lasting imprint. Trust had been broken, justice had been served, and the lessons learned would echo for years to come. The battle had been fierce, the stakes unimaginably high, but ultimately truth prevailed. And in the world of communities, leaders, and secrets, that truth was a light that could never be fully extinguished.